Tom sat in the hospital waiting room, awash in despair. It was the helplessness that tore at him the most. An orderly had settled him and checked in occasionally, but otherwise, he was alone. Part of him was still trying to decide if that was a good thing. A second medical detachment had been put on standby during the chaos at the Northern Palace, as Princess Indara accompanied Prince Adam away for his safety. It was all for the sake of appearances. Surströmming and durian stank like an open sewer individually, but while the combination was ungodly, there was never any risk involved. Calling in a second medical team for Princess Kalira appeared to be standard procedure, and keeping appearances looking outwardly normal in the midst of all the chaos had mattered. It came out of nowhere. I didn't even see it coming. The royal limo was little more than a heavily disguised armoured personnel carrier, but the cargo drone had smashed down on it like a hammer. He'd been oblivious to the accident behind them as his car sped on. In the frantic minutes after the death had sped into action, Captain Biona had taken charge, called in the emergency teams, and ordered the vehicle bearing him and the painters back to the academy, followed by the car bearing the girls. The limo was the last passenger vehicle in their motorcade. By the time they told him about the accident, it was already out of sight. A rich man once asked the Zen master Sengai for a blessing on his family. The master wrote, "Father dies, son dies, grandson dies." The rich man became angry. "I asked you for a blessing. Why would you make a joke like this?" Sengal explained, "If you should die before your son, you would grieve greatly. If your grandchild should pass away before you and your son, you would both be broken-hearted. If your family passes away in this order, generation after generation, it is the natural course of life. I call this real prosperity." The koan ran through his mind as he sat alone, rising from the depths of his memory with dreadful menace. What use was money at a time like this? Some, to be sure. The Prince Ardava Royal Hospital appeared to be set out for use by the imperial family. In the chaos that followed the collision, the medical detachment that swept onto the scene had brought the survivors here. It was an exclusive wing, offering the best of care. Right now, exclusive meant that he had a comfortable chair the right size for a man, in a well-appointed room where he could wait in privacy. Other than that, no one knew anything, or could offer him any information. That seemed to be universal. He couldn't help but wonder how long Miv and Leia had sat in this room when he'd been the patient. Not long after the motorcade stopped, and he'd been split off from the painters. Not long after the awful news was relayed to him, as gently as Biona could manage. It had taken another few miles before Princess Kalira stepped in, insisting he be told. Secure in the car with the other girls, her masquerade as Kalira's assistant had done its work. Was there any comfort in that? Deshin was an adult, and she'd gone into this knowing the risks. Ikkyu was a very clever apprentice as a boy, and his master had a precious antique teacup. Ikkyu accidentally broke the cup and was greatly perplexed about what to do. Hearing the footsteps of his teacher, he held the pieces behind him, and when his master arrived, he asked, "Why do people have to die?" "This is natural," said the old man. "Everything has just so long to live." Ikkyu produced the shattered cup and nodded. "It was time for your cup to die." The response team had pulled the survivors from the mangled wreckage, and somewhere not far from him, doctors were hard at work, fighting to save Deshin and Solani's lives, as well as that of Sergeant Vaco. Sergeant Kalani had been pronounced dead at the scene. Tom tried to remember what she'd looked like from the planning session they'd held in the IOTC auditorium. It seemed like a lifetime ago. It took him a minute to remember they were the pair who loved the Rubik's Cubes, and for the life of him he couldn't recall which was which as he sat there. Once there was a man named Tom Warwick. His father passed away, and he went to a funeral and the wake, attended by countless people he didn't know. Later, his friend told him he'd been there with him all through the funeral, and he realized he couldn't remember a thing about the event. Not one single thing. Was it shock? In hindsight, he'd never decided. Back on Earth, his father was dead, mother dead, brother dead, wife and daughter dead. His last e-message from Paul was that their friend Cindy was dead. Was that all that surviving was? Outlasting one person after another, year after year, until you were the one being remembered? In so many ways, it already felt like he was the only one left. Aside from his sister and the occasional meetings Paul hosted, he'd been alone. Coming to Shill had been like starting over. A whole new world so free of attachments that it felt like death didn't exist. That, somehow, he had escaped the desolation of his past and the bleak promise of his future. A merchant met Death in Damascus. Death looked surprised, but then recovered his ghastly composure and said, "I am coming for you tomorrow." The terrified man brought a camel and rode all day and all night to the city of Aleppo. The next day, Death knocked on the door of the room where he was hiding and said, "I was surprised to see you in Damascus yesterday, because I knew we had an appointment today in Aleppo." Shill was no sanctuary, but for a time it had felt like one. Even when he'd been laying here with a knife wound in his side, somehow it hadn't seemed real. Miv and Leia, Desians and Shiki, Solani, all the girls, Jama, Ganya, all the people who'd poured into his life were precious to him, yet part of him couldn't believe in it. He'd been waiting to die on Earth with nothing to lose. Part of him still couldn't let that go. Accepting the universe and fatalism look a lot alike from the outside, if you fake it hard enough. It wasn't true, and hadn't been for months now. His fatalism, the waiting for the end, had begun slipping away the day Miv appeared, but it had taken sitting here alone to crush the illusion, grinding it under the reality of this possible loss. The universe had opened itself up and restored life, love, and family to a man who couldn't quite believe it happened, and now the universe was threatening to take it away, all over again. Captain Biona had promised she would notify his wives while he was taken to the hospital. Somewhere beyond these walls, Miv and Leia would be on their way, while doctors fought for Deshin and Solani's lives. Somewhere beyond these walls, Melondi and the girls were secure, back on campus. Somewhere, Adam and Indara were safe. Desi had been the only passenger when the cargo drone had dropped from the heavens. Time, stand still. Tom clasped his hands together and prayed for this all to be a nightmare. For death not to come for those he loved again. For them all to be back in class once more, before his stupid plan had brought all this about. For an indifferent universe to be fair, just this once. Please, please, let time stand still. Much as Tommy Steinberg, aka Rosenberg, aka Stone Mountain, loved the Pezrin, even he approached the thought of letting two cats out of that can with apprehension. Part of him was tempted to just pop the top, throw it in the water, and let the contents sort themselves out. In lieu of a big body of water to ditch two angry Pezrin in, he'd elected to just drive them way out of town, keep a taser on hand, and be ready to run like hell. That seemed like the best plan, so when he got to the beach, Tom dragged the can out of the van, crackled the taser to life with one hand, and yanked the lid off with the other. Turned out he didn't even need to run for it. The smell made him lurch back all on his own. That and two woozy Pezrins sliding out. Tom had been ready for a fight, but the way the girl staggered to her feet and promptly flopped over, it seemed he wouldn't need the taser after all. The other cat laid there moaning and retching slightly. Seems their weakness is surströmming, Tom supposed, and durian ice cream. That would be good to know. Only problem was, it was everyone's weakness. No use incapacitating someone if it left you dry-heaving too. The boy looked like he was puking again, so Tom gingerly flipped him over onto his stomach, Just in time too. With a quick "Hick" from the girl, and a longer, more drawn-out "Bleh" from the boy, Tom got intimately familiar with the contents of Pejrin's stomachs. It looked surprisingly normal. He just hoped it didn't stain shoes. Know what? If the one was puking, there was a non-zero chance the other could turn it loose. Tom flipped the girl over, still trying not to stare. He might have been pushing 40, but who didn't love a good college girl? But this was neither the time nor the place, and the stuff in her fur was just gross. Besides, Tom could think about boobs when he was off the clock. It wasn't like he didn't already. Tom sighed and tossed the girl kitty his jacket. They'd have a long walk back, but at least she'd have something to wear on their walk into town. Fuck if he'd want it back after. Being part of the Inquisition was weird, like this, more often than he wanted to admit. Half of it was dead drops and handoffs, spycraft, and the occasional assassination, boredom and moments of sheer terror. The other half was regular old, "You did what?" material. Dropping off 2 half-conscious Pejrin on the beach, covered in rotted herring, melted ice cream, and barf, was 100% the latter. All that aside, there was nowhere private on Shill. The longer he stayed out here with 2 semi-conscious cat people drenched in ungodly goo, the more likely somebody would notice. With that in mind, he gave the can one last shake to get the goop out, and put the lid back on. As he put the can in the car, he looked back at the Pejrin. Their world would probably stop spinning by high tide. Probably. Tom could have dropped them further from the water, but oh well. At the very least, the thought of a crab hanging from the boy's ear was amusing. Milk toast, as Tom had found him to be, that was probably the most excitement he could handle. At least they can wash up. Tom got back in the car. He still expected the ride to handle poorly, force of habit, but it turned out grav vans didn't have issues on unstable ground. The thing whirred back onto the main road. This thing rides better than mine. Shame I can't keep it when I ditch this op. The palace van was huge, but it wasn't perfect. Much as Tom wanted to turn on radio 666 and jam out, he turned his omnipad to the work bands first, or as Tom called them, the spy bands. This far out it was pretty spotty, and kept buzzing in and out, but Tom made out a few words on the constable's frequency. All units respond. Car crash en route. Princess Calera. Multiple lanes closed as... Well, shit. It seemed Thomas Steinberg wasn't done working just yet. He flipped over to radio 666, just in time for the morning programming to start. Pirate stations were rare in the Empire. The jockeys were probably nut jobs, and they moved up and down the dial. But they still had all the best stuff. Good morning, Creantori! Got a funny story for you today about the bigwigs at the Northern Palace. Apparently the chef tried to poison them or something. You believe that? About damn time too. All those nobles in one place, no empress around. And that is why I confide to you as I hide inside my bona fide fortified carbide bunker. It was nearly midnight, and Adam McGinnis stared at the tabletop and rubbed his chin, feeling the rough stubble of whiskers under his fingertips, as Classy read off the situation report. He looked up when she paused. Is that all of it? Classy canted her head and regarded her husband, forcing down her love for him beneath the veneer of a trained professional, even as she knew he was doing the very same thing. Her life with him, together with Sel, Ferry and Slip as her co-wives, had been everything she'd ever dared dream of. But after his rescue from Duchess Vixhalee, Adam had never been quite the same man. She knew what she was seeing as she looked at him, and she knew why. Almost all. Slip, Sel and Ferry split off on the motorcade after the assessment. She set the omnipad aside. They should be here in about 2 hours. They're coming in from the field. Adam closed his eyes and rested his chin on steepled hands, but his voice was sharp. What happened to going back after Satora's killer? That was the plan. The plan's changed. I called them in. She held up a hand, forestalling Adam as his eyes snapped open. They're worried about us, and we're all worried about you. Me? Adam's voice rose in the protest she'd been expecting. What the hell do I have to do with it? The lessons of youthful training in deportment didn't fail her, though she dearly wanted to sigh. She rose instead, crossing the room to slip her arms around his shoulders. Chenok, beloved husband, you never recovered from that boy's death, and I think your grief over his death is the most male thing I've ever seen you do. We all started worrying over you when Satora was killed. She was only free, Classy. Free! Adam tried shrugging in her embrace, but she held on as he looked up at her. All of you want her killer as badly as I do. More even, after they put Ferry in the hospital with that damn trap. She could have died. We know, and you know we do. She held him tighter. How many times had they talked about children over the years? Trying to talk with him about adoption, only for his walls to go up. This time it was Kalira's friend, but it could have just as easily been Kalira, and we know what that's doing to you, even if you still don't want to talk about it. Talk about it? Adam shrugged her off and stood up, his back to the table and his voice raw. How do you think this is the right time to talk about it? Fuck! We gave Warwick a new daughter only a couple of months ago, and right now he doesn't know if she'll live or die. We need to be out in the field putting a stop to this shit, not stuck here in the palace. And we will, but we have to do this the right way. Classy kept her voice low, blocking out the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Goddess, she loved Adam, but this was no time for misdirected anger or other issues to get in the way. She had married a human, and for all that she and her co-wives loved him with all their hearts, he was a product of his world. Born and raised outside a monarchy, Adam was a commoner from a tiny nation of commoners. For all that he'd adapted, he still was that man at times. We should have seen this coming, Adam. My sharing a vehicle with Kalira was asking for trouble. I've been fourth in line for the throne since the news arrived that Kalandri was killed, and no matter how you work it out, removing Kalira and myself in one blow would have been decisive. Indara drew a breath and stood up, one hand on the table as she lifted her chin. It was time to state the obvious. We simply didn't believe anyone would be this brazen, but it could have been worse. Adam opened his mouth to protest, but he glowered instead, his mind already working over the possibilities. Fine, that's fucked up, but I get it. Nobody wants a chance having an emperor after the last time, and if you and Kalira were killed, the houses would back Kami against a wall to name Komodri as a heir. Even if only Kalira died, Kami would be left with one hell of a choice between Maud and you, with Laurel running a distant third. She hates it when you call her that. I know. Classy suppressed a smile that tugged at her lips. You aren't entirely right about Laurel's odds, though. Not after all the effort we put into our cover as the royal layabouts of the galaxy. She bit out the words, glossing over the implications. We don't know how it was managed yet, but cargo drones don't malfunction like that. They just don't, and it could have been 2 drones, or 3, or 10. At least whoever's behind this still wants it to look like an accident, however improbable that might be. You say that like we don't know who is behind this. That bit with Tejo? Satora's murder? Adam growled. Zariva keeps missing the target, but we've had a damn good idea ever since the Serhart girl came forward. Half the advantage she's had all this time has come from the palace, because nobody wants to start a panic with rumors of a family coup. And it would. She nodded, ignoring his growl. Adam's blood was up, and she knew the signs. Now's the time to handle things their way. Not as the royal family, but as their family. You're right that this needs to end, but we need to put things in place first. I never believed this plan would work. That's why we came up with a backup, but once they were out and back on the road, I at least figured they were home free. And I know what you aren't talking about, Classy. Now isn't the time, but I promise we will talk about it later. Adam stood there, his body taut like he needed someone to fight. What about Maud? She's your cousin, but she's got to be in this up to her neck.
Removing Zariva will take care of the threat to Kalera. We'll make sure she's alright. Maud will wait until we get back.
Adam gave her a rebellious scowl, but Indara stood her ground.
The news feeds are already all over this. Tomorrow morning you need to visit Princess Kalera while she is in the hospital before her speedy recovery. I want you to visit with Warwick and his daughter instead and see how the girls from Pod 7 are doing.
I'm the man, so I get to be the doting uncle visiting the hospital. I get that. Adam subsided, but his eyes were keen as they fixed on hers. He left his questions unsaid, but she already knew what they were.
I'll be issuing a statement to the press about the banquet and the accident early in the morning.
Classy nodded and moved to take him in her arms.
Over lunch, I'll be meeting with the Minister of Transportation to express my concerns over public safety. But before that, I'll be seeing Minister Raylan and Minister Potak.
She could feel Adam tense up as she held him. Meeting with the Interior and Justice was a formality before the Inquisition acted, and the work had usually fallen to him, but the circumstances demanded something else. The public knew Adam adored Kalera and the little princesses Prindi and Satora. Their frequent visits to check on Prin had been one of the few things that kept Adam from running out into the field with the others after Satora's death. His visit to the hospital to check on Kalera would be exactly the sort of thing people would expect to see from a caring male. This time, it left her to get on with their real work. Once the public formalities were over, it would be a different day indeed. Minister Lorem Raylin felt every one of her 43 years as she settled down across from her counterpart in the Ministry of Justice, High Advocate Opimea Potak. While just as old as she was, Edixi women seemed to age gracefully, and Potak never seemed to run out of drive. Every so often, on mornings like this, she decided she could learn to hate Opimea for it. Still, even she could tell that the toll was beginning to mount. Opimea's convictions were like a black hole, where doubt spiraled in and disappeared from the universe, and she pulled the Ministry of Justice along in her orbit. The woman had a sense of certainty that most fervent Shivanti could bend titanium bars around, but Lorem had known her for years now, and Potak was flagging. Outwardly, she still had her zeal toward her work, but as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to months without any result, her usual zest seemed to be waning, as if the work had lost its flavour. While kept from the public as a suicide, the death of Lorau's wife, Aurelia, had taken on renewed life with their continued failure to find Satora's killer. There were too many inconsistencies, too many loose ends that needed to be re-examined. Potak's arena was the courts, and her reach over the wider constabulary was minor, but it was there. Since the victims were both members of the royal court, oversight of the investigations had fallen upon them both. The circumstances of Aurelia's death needed to be reopened, but with the Empress's protracted absence, alarming a skittish public, only fed the schemes of an avaricious nobility. As the weeks turned into months, more than one young idiot began testing her limits. Nothing overt as yet, but there was no room for mistakes. With the Empress away, everything needed to be handled with discretion and dispatch, all of which made this morning's subterfuge with Princess Indara a relief, mixed with dread. Thankfully, Princess Indara Tassu had a sense of decorum her husband often lacked. She'd engaged in pleasantries for almost 6 full minutes.
Ministers, as much as I enjoy your company, my time is brief. I have pressing engagements to see to, and the media is already clamouring for statements regarding the events of last evening.
Indara perched elegantly in her chair, but there was no misunderstanding as she got down to the point.
All evidence points to actions directed by Princess Camaldry through her head of security. While that falls into the discretion of the Empress and the Interior, the Inquisition proposes an immediate sanction on Special Agent Zariva. Does Justice concur?
Lorem registered the courtesy for what it was. The sanction Indara was proposing was no impotent threat by some isolated governess or overambitious matriarch. Zariva was one of her agents, and the Ministry of Justice had no jurisdiction here. The request to Potak was a formality, and they all knew it.
The tide of these events has been troubling. Deeply troubling,
Potak rumbled. The woman had a gifted voice, devoid of any accent, and she'd used it as one more tool to establish her reputation as a pillar of legal rectitude. She could also be a colossal pain in the clam, but no one had ever doubted her devotion to duty. Oppermayor Potak would take on opponents from the most influential of houses, and even tell the Empress where to stick a policy she didn't agree with, demurring with one of her melodious,
"As your Majesty wishes. Given the weight of evidence, I believe it's in the best interests of the body politic and the safety of the royal family to proceed."
Long-winded or not, Potak was one of that rarest breed, an incorruptible woman, and once she made up her mind, it would be easier to escape the sea of heavy souls.
Justice votes yes.
A simple yes would have sufficed, but as even this was uncharacteristically brief for Oppermayor. The Inquisition could act without let or hindrance once they were turned loose, and this vote was a meagre check on their activities. A nod to the role of justice and the interior. It still served a purpose, but Oppermayor's approval provided the necessary majority, which meant that she didn't have to condemn one of her own.
If only it were that easy. The interior also votes yes.
Raylin seldom drank, but she felt the need for something, if only to hold it in her hands for moral support. Tea was civilized, but it failed to meet the gravity of the moment. With nothing appropriate to hand, she pressed on.
Your Highness, there are some particulars you need to be aware of. I'd hoped never to have this conversation, but matters have moved past that, and since you're going after Zariva, there are things you need to know.
Indara canted her head, with a graceful gesture to explain. In one of those rare twists of family genetics, she was statuesque like her mother, but most of her qualities came from her grandmother, Empress Callista. The memories of her old friend brought a pang to her heart, wrapped in the veil of cherished memories, but she pushed them aside. Events were emotion, and she owed it to Callista to see this through.
You may find Zariva to be a difficult target, thanks to her particular background. Because of that, I'm prepared to put her in an exposed position, rather than have your team invade the Northern Palace to extract her.
Lorem paused, giving Indara a moment to consider the advantages.
I think the palace has had rather more excitement than is good for his reputation. As such, I intend to summon Agent Zariva to my offices for a personal debriefing on last night's event. It would be best for all concerned if she never arrives for that briefing.
Indara nodded graciously, though Lorem hadn't expected anything less. The woman's codename, Classy, was apt, although the irony didn't escape notice. Indara was far more than a capable deathshead. She was ruthless, efficient, and effective, and utterly wasted in her present position. Yes, the fault began with her mother, Arduina, but still, it was time for the woman to get past it and move into the next phase of her life. There was only one Indara Tazu, and it was high time she realized it.
There's no easy way to say this, so I will go to the depths of the matter. Special Agent Zariva has an intimate familiarity with the Inquisition, and if you attempt to remove her from the Northern Palace, it could involve unacceptable damage.
As a euphemism, it was lousy, but Indara had a streak of pride in her character a light year wide. It was unfortunate that it wasn't matched by self-awareness, but Zariva had years to turn the palace into a fortress, a working knowledge of Indara's team, and despite her eccentricities, she wasn't a fool. In all likelihood, she was expecting the Inquisition, and wanted things on her terms. This isn't a challenge to your competence, but as Minister of the Interior, it's my responsibility to protect you. Please trust me when I tell you that an attempt in the palace's confines will go very badly, and I don't want to see you or your family come to harm.
I trust you have your motives, but I'm waiting for the explanation.
Indara poured herself a cup of tea before returning to their table, and while her manner remained polite, her voice grew progressively cooler.
The operations of the Inquisition are restricted, and while I understand Zariva had clearance as part of the FSD, you didn't say she has a working knowledge. You said she has intimate familiarity. My grandmother, Empress Callista, and my aunt, Empress Kamalesh, both made it clear that the Inquisition has virtually complete discretion in our activities, and I'd very much like to believe you're about to explain. Almost, yes. The important word is virtually. Awareness of your activities by senior members of the Interior has occasionally facilitated your exit from one planet or another with a minimum of fuss.
Which was true as far as it went, and Lorem folded her hands on her lap, while Potak watched impassively.
When the Empress Callista decided to reinstate the Inquisition, she also felt that there needed to be certain controls. Special Agent Zariva was partnered with Princess Camordri during her time with the Interior as a possible check on your activities, as a contingency if the Inquisition lost its way. Contingency?
Indara's words could have been chipped out of ice.
You don't actually think Camordri would be able to stop me? I don't think she'd be able to stop your husband on his worst day, and with one hand tied behind his back, but she provided the clout for a political intervention, should it have proven necessary.
Lorem shook her head, dismissing the notion.
Away from Shill, the only person able to gainsay you, Your Highness, was another princess. Thankfully for all concerned, the Inquisition stayed true to its mandate, and intervention was not necessary. But Callista was my friend, as well as my Empress. Please understand, she had faith in you and your wives, and the utmost hope for your husband. But she was also prepared to be proven wrong. She never believed she would be, but she was ready all the same.
Lorem watched as Indara schooled her features, taking a sip of tea before speaking. Adam would probably have thrown a fit, but he'd eventually have reached the same conclusion as Indara. The pair and their wives were all made for each other, which should frighten anyone with a functioning brain.
I see. So if not Camordri... Exactly.
Reaching for her omnipad, Lorem opened Kadira Zariva's personal file.
The Empire maintains a navy beyond counting, and a marine corps that is legion. Even spread out across the galaxy in companies and pods, the number of death's heads could fill an army or two. But part of my work is to maintain visibility on those individuals who still manage to stand over the rest. Kadira Zariva isn't just a trained killer, or even just a gifted one. She has certain skills, as well as an appetite for the work which allowed her to excel beyond her peers. But they also led to certain discrepancies.
Indara set aside her tea.
Discrepancies.
The princess was still sitting comfortably, but her demeanor had taken on a keen and dangerous edge that Lorem knew very well. Lorem knew she wasn't young anymore. Her youth and skill had been replaced by experience and treachery, and while Indara wasn't a girl, this was an old woman's game.
Let me give you her file.
She picked up her omnipad and swiped the file across to Indara's.
I believe it contains everything your team will need to know.
Callista had understood the Interior when it was functioning properly. She hadn't liked it, but she had taken steps to make sure it did. But Camordri was still Kamalesh's daughter. There might be understanding, but there would never be forgiveness. She prayed to the goddess no one would ever realize Zariva's appointment as Camordri's handler. That all of the handlers were put in place, in the regrettable event that a princess needed to die. The tree of the Tazu family bore two kinds of fruit, the sweet and the bitter, and the Interior tended that tree with care.